I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. The United States and China reached a 90-day truce in the trade war when their representatives met in Geneva in early May. Both sides agreed to temporarily roll back most of the tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. President Trump announced that a, quote, total reset in U.S.-China relations had been achieved. Beyond the hyperbole, the two sides agreed to establish a mechanism on economics and trade and launch negotiations to address trade imbalances and other problems. Whether a deal is reached and what it might look like, what it might include, remains to be seen. The future trajectory of U.S.-China relations overall is still unclear. Today, we're going to hear a Chinese perspective on the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, including on the recent trade talks and the factors that will influence U.S.-China relations going forward. My guest is Sun Chenghao. He's a fellow and head of the U.S Europe program at Tsinghua University's Center for International Security and Strategy. He's also a council member of the Chinese Association of American Studies. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Chenghao.
Hi, Bonnie. Thanks for having me here today.
So everybody from China who has come through Washington, D.C., whom I have met in the last several months since Donald Trump took office again, has asked me, what does Trump want from China? And I've heard that there's a debate among experts in China about this. And some people, I've been told, have claimed that Trump wants a deal, even a grand bargain, and was just trying to build negotiating leverage with the United States. And then others said that Trump really wants to suffocate or kill the Chinese economy. So is that debate correct? Is it still ongoing, or is it settled? What do most Chinese scholars think now about President Trump's intentions?
Well, thanks for the question. I think overall, the debate about what Trump really wants from China is still ongoing here. I think here scholars generally focus on three possible motivations behind Trump's decisions. First, his use of tariffs to tackle the numbers, namely eliminating the trade deficit and increasing American manufacturing jobs. This approach often described as the deal-maker strategy, which means treating tariffs as bargaining tools to pressure China. And Trump's goal is to shrink the U.S.-China trade imbalance and bring back jobs to American factories. Second, the second school is the institutional pressure on China to change its model of economic development by using tariff as a tool. And this view sees the trade war as an institutional fight. In other words, tariffs isn't just about shrinking the trade deficit, but about forcing China to reform its economic system. For example, some hardliners, in the trade team of the White House, not only insist on keeping high tariffs in place, but want to deploy them as part of a broader high-pressure push to reshape China's economic model. The third school, I think, is a deeper containment strategy, as you have mentioned, suffocate China's economy. I think people here believe they are aiming at slowing China's long-term rise through economic pressure rather than mere short-term wins. Some scholars here argue that what Washington truly wants is to undermine China's long-term rise through sustained economic and trade pressure, not just to win a short-term numbers game. So to sum up, most Chinese scholars still see Trump primarily as a deal maker, someone focused on maximizing quick wins at the bargaining table. But a vocal minority wants that these tariffs might evolve into a structural tool of containment, which aimed at curbing China's rise for decades to come.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, which view do you hold?
I think for Trump himself, I think he focused most on the numbers. I think because he's a businessman, right, before the president. So I think his major target is trying to eliminate the trade deficits and try to bring back the jobs to the manufacturing sectors. But I do believe that there are some people in the White House believe tariffs could be used as a tool to crack down on China's rise in the long term.
So I'm curious how people in China are assessing the talks in Geneva. I was reading that the former editor of Global Times, Hu Xijin, made some comment about how Beijing had basically won the first round. The government's narrative seems to be that Beijing stuck with its resolute principles and its firm countermeasures, and that they were effective. Is that the true assessment? Is everybody think that China sort of won, and or is this mostly just sort of propaganda for the public? I mean, in my view, the talks have hardly started yet. We just had an agreement to launch negotiations. So whenever journalists ask me who won, I say it's not over. So what's your view?
Yeah, very good question. I think after Geneva talks, both China and the US almost simultaneously declared victory. China called the outcome highly constructive, stressing that China pushed the US to make concessions, while I also noticed that some US commentators and officials likewise celebrated substantial progress. And here some scholars even joked that the word win-win has a new meaning, because sometimes some Chinese scholars believe win-win means China win twice, right? But it seems to mean both sides simply get to claim that they have won respectively. So win-win has a new meaning now in China. And I think once the news of temporary tariff was disclosed, global markets respond very positively. So which means it gives investors a short-term confidence boost. But yes, it's a 90-day cooling off window. We have opportunity to discuss further. But in my opinion, none of the key disagreements have actually been resolved. For example, on trade deficits and jobs concerns, the two sides merely pledged to keep talking without putting forward any real roadmap to narrow the US-China trade gap or secure American manufacturing employment. And on the structural reform of China's economic model, where US calls for SOE overhaul, tougher IP rules, or broader market access, I don't think China have moved beyond general acknowledgements with no dates or targets set. Meanwhile, in high-tech sectors like semiconductors, export controls remain firmly in place, and Washington has even stepped up AI-related restrictions in recent weeks. So my hunch is that over the next 90 or less than 90 days, a lot of attention will shift to the issue of fentanyl-related tariffs. Under the joint statement, total US tariffs on Chinese goods will stay currently around 50%, and about 20% is tied specifically to fentanyl concerns. China has said clearly that its countermeasures against those two rounds of fentanyl-related tariffs remain in force. So I expect the fentanyl talks will still be very tough. So when you mix public health issues with trade tools, it becomes really hard to accurately target illegal precursor flows. And maybe it also risks exporting legitimate chemicals, especially since many of the fentanyl precursors are used to make the other medicines. It's true that Geneva talk brought a brief sigh of relief, but it didn't actually resolve those deep-seated disagreements. But one bright spot I would like to stress is that Geneva talk has set up a regular economic trade dialogue mechanism, which is, I believe, as valuable as the tariff cuts, because keeping both sides' trade teams talking is what really guarantees the progress. After all, before this round of talks, no one was even sure what Trump wanted from China, as you have mentioned in the first question. And without this channel, I think the US might never have known what Beijing was after either. Now, at least, we have a clearer sense of which US officials are actually authorized by Trump to speak on trade and economic matters. That's very important, I think.
So what do you think a good deal would really look like? I remember going back to 2017 in the first Trump administration, the two sides negotiated and came up with this comprehensive trade deal. And according to the book that was co-authored by Bob Davis and Ling Wei, that deal went up to the Politburo Standing Committee and was ultimately rejected, including by Xi Jinping. And I think that has led many observers to be skeptical that a very broad deal that would really even the playing field between the United States and China is even feasible. So is it better to go back to something like the Phase 1 deal, which is far narrower and primarily dealt with large-scale purchases by China from the United States, also with intellectual property protection and opening of financial services? But one of the things that we know Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talked about in his confirmation hearing was the possibility of updating the Phase 1 trade deal. So which approach makes more sense to you? What do you think Beijing is seeking?
I think looking ahead, the most, not the best, but the most practical outcome over the next 90 days would be further tariffs, lowering tariffs, and China to buy more U.S. agricultural and energy products. As you have mentioned, that the Phase 1 deal, we have already reached those achievements. Meanwhile, the U.S. could consider encouraging Chinese investment in select sectors. This short-term pause, I think, provides much needed room for businesses and workers in both countries, helping to prevent widespread shutdowns and layoffs. However, even after this cut, remaining tariffs continue to pose a significant obstacle to fully restoring trade flows and mutual confidence. But if we look at it from a long-term perspective, what is a good deal? I think a truly good deal for China and the US needs two essential components. First, during this initial 90-day window, the two sides must set up a sustainable tariff adjustment mechanism that lets them flexibly lower tariffs based on real progress at the negotiation table. Second, they should establish a consultation group composed of both government officials and business representatives to continuously to monitor how tariffs are implemented and how agreed upon reforms are unfolding, with the ability to adjust policies timely. Of course, having said that, I think uncertainties remain. On the US side, trade policy is highly dependent on the president's personal approach, so it's unclear whether the current arrangement will last beyond the next 3 months. And within Washington, different stakeholders have varying expectations for any future deal and do not always share the same goals. In China, leadership must balance advancing reforms with maintaining economic stability. And we have already witnessed recent initiatives from the Chinese government, for example, expanding domestic demand and strengthening domestic circulation strategy, focus on boosting services, consumptions, and support, for example, for the elder care industry. So at the same time, China also has launched its 2025 initiative list this year, which aims to ease market access and build a unified national market. So in short, I think a pragmatic and effective agreement should not only give both sides more time for negotiations and market adjustments, but also institutionalize those communication channels, allowing China and the US to maintain consistent dialogue on trade and broader economic matters, I think.
After the talks in Geneva, Donald Trump told the media, and I'll quote here, "They've agreed to open China, fully open China, and I think it's going to be fantastic for China, and I think it's going to be fantastic for us, and I think it's going to be great for unification and peace." So I think some people were a little confused about what he meant by that statement. And apparently there was a report that a U.S. official in Taiwan said that Trump's reference to unification was about the U.S.-China trade relationship, that it was not about Taiwan. So when I hear the word unification, I usually think about cross-strait relations.
That's right. That's right.
You read that? And what do you think
Yeah.
are the implications of his comment?
Yeah, my first impression is also maybe unification is about Taiwan. But I think, in any way, I think Trump's use of the term unification highlights the complexities of the political language. Because in American discourse, I think unification could also refer to economic integration or trade alignment. But yes, when we focus on the political issues or focus on the cross-strait relations, it is interpreted as the political unification of Chinese Taiwan with Chinese mainland. So this duality can lead to significant misunderstandings. it's possible that the Trump administration's choice of such a term was a kind of a move to draw media attention and test the reactions of both domestic and international audiences. Although the current use of unification solely refers to economic matters, as the White House has explained, the politicization of trade language may set a precedent for the future negotiations on more sensitive issues. Linking economic resets with broader political goals may undermine the neutrality of trade cooperation and introduce greater uncertainty and potential spillover risks in future diplomatic engagements. But having said that, I don't believe China and the US will reach a so-called strategic bargain on Taiwan because of trade. Overall, this statement indicates that the Trump administration continues to prioritize trade as the central element of China-US relations, wrapping political issues in economic language. In my view, it is crucial for the US to strike a careful balance between rhetoric, strategy, and policy to avoid this kind of misinterpretations that could escalate regional tensions. So going forward, it is important to watch whether the US will keep using ambiguous these political terms in the next round of talks. At the same time, some Chinese scholars believe that attention should be paid to the possibility that the Trump administration may try to use Taiwan as a bargaining chip to pressure China, as such a move would be extremely risky for the bilateral relations.
Well, I certainly hope that we don't bring any issues pertaining to Taiwan into the trade talks. I think it would complicate things greatly.
Yeah, that's right.
I wanted to ask you about how important you think the strategic channel was in the Biden administration and whether it should be reestablished. So, of course, in the Biden administration, the strategic channel referred to the talks between the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and Wang Yi in China, who is dual-hatted. He's the foreign minister as well as the head of China's Foreign Affairs Commission. And there are certainly people in the Biden administration who believed very much that channel was important in stabilizing the relationship, especially after the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. And so I'm wondering whether you think, do we need such a channel today? And if so, who should be the interlocutors?
Yes, I think, this strategic channel, I think it's very important for China and also for the bilateral relations. On the one hand, we shouldn't overlook the outcomes it helped produce in the past. So as you have mentioned, under the Biden administration, this channel, I think, enabled cooperative efforts between China and the US in areas such as climate change and artificial intelligence governance. It also provided a platform for the both sides to exchange views on regional hotspots and laid the groundwork for mechanisms such as Mu communication, intergovernmental AI dialogue, and even presidential-level summits. On the other hand, I think the sustained dialogue helps both sides better understand each other's policies and reduce the risk of miscalculation. This is especially important now as both governments continue to introduce new trade and technology policies. In such a context, direct communication is very critical for clarifying intent. I once heard a metaphor by an American friend. He said, what one side intends as a cherry might be misunderstood by the other as an apple. For example, is the US small yard high fence tech policy still in effect? And if so, can we define the boundaries of competition? These are questions that can only be answered through regular and candid exchanges. However, one challenge in maintaining the channel today lies in identifying the appropriate counterparts to engage with. Within Trump team, it seems that currently no one could play a role like Jake Sullivan, someone who not only represents the director of administration's China policy, but can also manage a controlled and a strategic form of competition. Officials like Treasury Secretary or Trade Representative who participate in the Geneva economic talks are important for easing tensions, but their job scope is relatively narrow. We still need broader engagement on issues such as security and advanced technologies. Some have suggested Marco Rubio as a possible figure, but he holds a tough stance on China and current currently under Chinese sanctions. Still, none of this should be still none of this should be an excuse to avoid engagement. So, given the unpredictability of a future Trump administration, we may need to consider more diverse channels, such as maybe the Congress peoples, state level officials, or others ready to help him move China-U.S. relations forward. Take Senator Steve Daines of Montana, for example. He acted as a kind of intermediate, like a kind of bridge between China and the U.S. Earlier this year, after meeting with Trump, he visited China and engaged with senior Chinese officials to convey policy messages. So while such informal channels may not replace formal dialogues, they can certainly complement it and help ensure that communications between the two countries remain open and ongoing.
Is there a consensus in China among experts that the United States is in decline and that China's position in the balance of power is strengthening compared to the United States? I know that's something that has been discussed for over a decade. But this phrase, that Xi Jinping continues to use, that changes are taking place that are unseen in a century, seems to me that this implies that the United States is in decline and that China is rising and will ultimately surpass the United States. So is that accurate, or would you have a different interpretation?
I think decline is a too simple word to describe the U.S. Position in the world. I mean, in Chinese academia, we also have some kind of debates. Of course, we think there is a relative decline in the U.S., the so-called hegemony power, because we think they have different pillars which support the U.S. hegemon. For example, the U.S. could boast of its alliance power, its financial power, its military power, security power, and we think those pillars are undergoing different changes. For example, if we look at the Trump administration's alliance policy, we don't believe that the U.S. is paying more attention or much attention to the alliance power, which means that there is a decline of this pillar. And also but we still believe that the U.S. is very advanced in high technology, in military. So I think when we talk about the decline of the U.S., maybe they will create some misinterpretations and misunderstandings about China's intention on describing the U.S. as a declining power. We think it's a relatively declining, but we don't believe that currently China is the number one and the U.S. is number two. And about the intention, the strategic intention of the China, whether China would like to surpass the U.S., I think we don't have the intention to do that, but Chinese are very confident that if the U.S. could not shore up these pillars in one day, at the end of the day, the U.S. will gradually decline to be the number two. That is a gradual process. It's not a strategy for China that we design this strategy. We want to surpass the U.S., but we are confident that if the U.S. still go on this way, maybe China one day will surpass the U.S. That is an outcome, but not a strategy.
You mentioned U.S. alliances, and I know you do some work on transatlantic relations. So I want to ask you what you think is the implication of some of the, shall we say, the shift in U.S. Policy toward alliances and the friction, I think, in the transatlantic relationship. Does it create an opportunity for China to try and take advantage of some of these differences that the U.S. has with Europe and certainly with other countries? That I was looking at some of the public opinion polls about global opinion toward the United States. There's one that's called the 2025 Democracy Perception Index, for example, and there was a significant majority of people who were polled that now have an overall negative perception of the United States, and it's quite a significant decline from last year. Many people are talking about a decline in U.S. soft power. So when people in China look at this shift in U.S. strategy and the impact on our relations with other countries, especially our allies, Is this seen as an opportunity? Is it seen as potentially providing instability in the international order? And how will China respond to this?
First of all, I think the current China-US competition isn't just about hard power. It's also very much a contest of soft power and institutional influence. So in third-party countries, both sides are actively expanding their appeal through trade, technological cooperation, infrastructure development, and cultural exchange. This competition is real, but it is not necessarily zero-sum. So in this context, it's true that the decline of the U.S. global image may open up some space for China. But again, this isn't the result of a so-called calculated Chinese strategy. It's the consequence of choices made by the US itself and the other countries. Like any other country, China pursues its national interests. It's not in China's playbook to capitalize on America's image problems to boost its own reputation. What China seeks is to make the most of a shifting global environment, to speak up more, to show more, and to stay focused on its own path, developing the economy, improving governance, and deepening external cooperation. So if the global narrative landscape is changing, China will adapt to that, but it's not trying to engineer it. As for China-Europe relations, as you mentioned, I think things are equally complex. Europe is in a difficult position navigating its relationships with most of the major powers like the US, Russia, and China. It's very interesting that Europe does not have a very good relations with all the powers, all the great powers currently. And the recent easing in China-EU ties is not just the result of China's outreach, it also reflects Europe's own strategic needs. That said, if US-EU trade negotiations go well, I think Europe might choose to align more closely with the US on China-related issues. After all, I think the US and Europe remain strategic allies. We've never assumed that a greater European strategic autonomy will automatically translate into Europe distancing itself from the US or moving closer to China. What we do hope, however, is that the future of China-Europe relations can be more independent on both sides. For Europe, that would mean shaping its China policy based on its own interests rather than simply taking sides. And for China, it means building a more independent and nuanced approach to Europe, one that isn't constantly filtered through the lens of so-called China-US competition. This kind of mutual independence could actually create more space and more stability for meaningful cooperation between China and Europe, I think.
So, lastly, I want to ask you about your view of the future of U.S.-China relations. So, look inside your crystal ball, and what do you think? First of all, for the remainder of the Trump administration, which has more than 3.5 years left, what would be the best case for the relationship in that period? And what do you think are the most salient factors that will shape U.S.-China relations going forward?
So from a more realist perspective, I think the best case scenario for China-US relations over the next 3.5 years might be what we can call competitive coexistence. It's not a full-blown Cold War marked by total decoupling and confrontation, but it's also far from the close cooperation we could witness during the heyday of globalization. It's more like a situation where both sides are stuck with each other, deeply intertwined but fiercely competitive. Neither side is comfortable with the status quo, but neither can fundamentally change the other, and neither wants to slide into outright conflict. So right now, if you look at areas like trade, supply chains, financial markets, and global governance, the two countries are still deeply interdependent. I don't think decoupling is really feasible. But at the same time, the old model of the so-called win-win cooperation is no longer yields the same benefits. In fact, interdependence itself has become a tool for leverage. So I think in the future, the most salient issue could still be the trade issue. But what I am concerned is not just trade itself. I think it is maybe the spillover effect of the trade. Because if I think there are still a lot of China hawks in the Trump administration, if some advisors within the Trump camp, for example, no longer believe a deal with China on trade is achievable, that frustration could bleed into areas like security policy, diplomacy, or even cultural exchanges. So that is what I am concerned now.
We've been talking with Sun Chenghao, who's a fellow and head of the U.S. Europe program at Tsinghua University's Center for International Security and Strategy. He does a lot of work on U.S.-China relations, too, and that's what we talked about today. So thank you so much for your insights, Chenghao.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you.